insisted he doesn't want a general election, but it's understood he'll call for one if MPs block no deal tomorrow. The Prime Ministers say there are no circumstances under which he'll ask for a Brexit delay. Labour's Hilary Benn tabled the motion which demands Mr Johnson seek a 3-month extension if there's no agreement in place by the 19th of October.
He makes the argument that somehow the bill that we've published is going to undermine his negotiations. I think the question the country needs to ask the Prime Minister is this: what negotiations?
Government sources suggest a snap election could take place before Brexit Day on the 14th of October. In other news, 4 people are confirmed dead and another 29 missing after a boat caught fire and sank off the coast of Southern California. The huge blaze broke out on the 75-foot commercial scuba diving vessel in the early hours of this morning. Captain Monica Rochester from the US Coast Guard says those missing had been in their cabins.
My understanding, or the report I received, they were below decks asleep. The crew was actually already awake and on the bridge, and they jumped off.
An 8-year-old boy has reportedly become the first victim of Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas. 165-mile-per-hour winds have been ripping roofs from homes and overturning cars. Detectives have described a 26-year-old man as arrogant after he admitted crushing 3-year-old Alfie Lamb to death with a car seat. Stephen Waterson from Gravesend in Kent had previously denied the manslaughter in South London, but changed his plea earlier. One of Sir Philip Green's main allies is understood to have stepped down from his position as Chief Operating Officer at Arcadia. 55-year-old David Shepherd, who previously managed Topman, is reported to be retiring. And celebrities and fans have been sending well wishes to Kevin Hart after the comedian was injured in a car crash in the United States. Dwayne Johnson posted on Instagram to urge the comic to stay strong. That's the latest. I'm Kit Bradshaw.
Love Sport Radio, on digital radio, online, mobile and smart speaker. This is the Get European Football Show on Love Sport.
Good evening, this is Love Sport Radio. You're listening to the Get European Football Show with the guys from Get Football, Adam White and Jeremy Smith. Take it away, chaps.
Yeah, it's going to be a really interesting show this week, Matt, I think. Lots going on this weekend over the European scene. Really exciting weekend in La Liga. Lots of goals. Fantastic game in Serie A between champions Juventus and Napoli. 4-3 there. We'll be talking about that later on. In France, 2 big wins for Marseille this week and some potentially big transfer news for Paris Saint-Germain. Mauro Icardi supposedly imminent at the Parc des Princes, and developments in that fledgling Bundesliga title race to come as well. We'll be discussing all of that over the course of the pod, as well as all those windows closing around the continent over the course of the show. But yes, we thought this week we'd start with the Champions League draw. An interesting one. What stands out for you?
I think we were discussing before we went on air that there's obviously the sort of leagues with or mini tables with the really big teams. There's Liverpool, Napoli obviously stands out again, repeat of last year. Bayern, Spurs is obviously an attractive fixture. Juventus, Atletico as well. But we were both saying how much we like groups G and H, which are on paper possibly the most sort of evenly balanced. Certainly Group G is the one that I'm attracted to, sort of Zenit, Benfica, Lyon, Leipzig. I think it's fair to say relatively easily matched teams, evenly matched rather. Possibly teams that also can blow hot or cold, can be anyone on their day, and other times kind of go out with a whimper. We mentioned that Lyon obviously last year they started the Champions League campaign with a brilliant win at the Etihad, and then followed that up with 5 draws. So I guess you could say they went through the group stage unbeaten, if you're a glass half full kind of person. But yeah, certainly that one looks really intriguing. And then Chelsea, Ajax, Valencia and Lille. Again, I mean, obviously looking at it from a French point of view, I think possibly Lille are slightly weaker than the other 3, but also capable of springing an upset. And certainly if you're looking to sort of plan a few Champions League away days and sort of weekends or long weekends into the middle of the week away, then possibly that's the group for you. London, Amsterdam, Valencia and Lille. Some really attractive visits there. Yeah,
it's a really interesting group. When we have these sorts of draws, whether it's a World Cup or a Champions League or even a Europa League, I sort of look at the top group of C's and think who's the weakest team there and who's the best team in the bottom group of C's, and try and pair them up, because you look at some of the groups and you think the PSG, Real Madrid, Club Brugge, Galatasaray group is kind of not a foregone conclusion, but there are two clear favourites there. Okay, Galatasaray have signed some interesting players over the course of the window, some from France, which we'll talk about over the course of the show. Some from Brighton as well. Florian Andone competing with Radamel Falcao for that central striker role at Galatasaray for sure. But you'd imagine that PSG and Real Madrid would qualify, and they would imagine that they would do it with minimal amounts of fuss. But then you look at that Group F and that Group G and Group H, and you think in Group G you could see Zenit, Benfica, Leipzig, or Lyon winning that group, and you could also see any of those teams finishing bottom of that group. With your French hat on, Jez, is it a good draw for the French teams that would be happy?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, PSG, as you said, PSG, Real Madrid. I think the fact that obviously it's the top two who go through, and certainly the recent years have shown that it really doesn't make that much difference whether you finish first or second. Actually, PSG have found that in a way to their disadvantage, where they finished top of their group. They've beaten teams like Liverpool, like Bayern Munich, and yet they've ended up with a harder second round draw than arguably than the team they've beaten into second. So on the basis that the top two qualify and there's probably not that much difference, as you said, I think PSG should be sort of comfortable at least in getting into the next round. And then Lyon and Lille, because of the seeding system, they were a little bit sort of subject to the luck of the draw, but I think you've got to say that it could have turned out a lot worse. Lyon especially, I think, really should be looking to get out of that group. As I said, it is relatively sort of homogenous, and it does depend on which Lyon turn up on each given day, but I think they should be a bit disappointed if they don't come out of that group. And Lille, I think, were always going to be sort of underdogs in whatever group they came out, but there as well, it's certainly a makeable group, and you know, I remember a few years ago when Marseille finished a group with 0 points, possibly Montpellier as well. I can't see Lille doing that this time. I think they're really I expect them to give a good account of themselves, and even if I do think they'll pull up just a little bit short, I think they're going to be competitive in every match, and I think they're going to give all three teams in the group a real challenge.
For sure. Was that Marseille group with Arsenal, Dortmund, Napoli, and they all finished on 12 points, and somebody went out with 12 points, and Marseille were the team that got beaten 6 times and finished with nothing. I guess the classic, cliched group of death tag goes to Group F. Barcelona, Borussia Dortmund, Inter and Slavia Prague will be very upset to be included in that group at the bottom. Which team goes out there, do you think? Interesting starts for all three teams, to be honest. Inter started well under Conte. Lukaku's got a couple of goals in a couple of games. Borussia Dortmund started very brightly. Bit of an upset at the weekend away at Union Berlin, which we'll discuss later on. And Barcelona very much a team under construction to some extent. Suarez and Messi still out injured. Griezmann's in. We were talking earlier, just before we came on, about Andrei ter Stegen getting more touches than Antoine Griezmann against Osasuna at the weekend in a 2-2 draw. An interesting one. Who goes out, do you think?
My instinct is to say, I've got it written down here as Barcelona, Dortmund, Inter and Slavia. It just happens to be written that way. But my instinct is that's how it's going to finish. But yeah, I'm not comfortable saying that at all. And again, it really depends. Barcelona have not started the season well. Partly because of injuries, partly because I think there's a few players there who until midnight tonight aren't 100% sure whether they're still going to be at Barcelona, and if they are, where in the team they're going to be playing. Dortmund have looked good for a couple of matches, but in all of their league matches so far, they've fallen behind and had to come back from behind. So that there are issues there, I think. And Inter always seem to be finding their feet every year. What kind of Inter are going to turn up? But certainly under Conte and with Lukaku, who for all his faults is a very reliable goal scorer, I expect them to be very difficult to beat. So not comfortable at all saying that I think Inter will finish third, but that's just my instinct for now.
Yeah,
there were great clips of the Slavia Prague representatives when the draw came out,
just looking absolutely livid.
Yeah.
Not even a chance in the Europa League. Perhaps it'd be great if they put up a fight. We thought that a little bit last year about Red Star and the Liverpool, Napoli, PSG group, and they were very competitive at home in particular. So Slavia Prague might fancy themselves to emulate that. I think this is not the perfect draw, but it suits Antonio Conte's style of management. He loves those marquee games against equally powerful sides. We saw of Italy at the Euros against Spain that he somehow manages to figure out some sort of tactical gambit. He drills his team into their lives and manages to get a result. And I think away at Dortmund, they're the type of team I can see Inter really sort of roughing up a little bit and getting a result, perhaps even at home to Barcelona. I think they're maybe even favourites for that group, given the fact that Conte's their coach and they've started so well, they look so solid. And then given that Dortmund have dropped off a little bit at the weekend and Barcelona are very similar, I think it might be between those two to see who goes out. Any upsets aside from that group? Do you see any upsets in there? Any sort of weaker teams or traditionally weaker teams forcing their way into the last 16?
Well, you mentioned Red Star. I think if they can sort of really make their home matches a really intimidating atmosphere, I think that's always going to be tricky. And Tottenham haven't particularly started the season brilliantly. I can see them sort of getting a little bit intimidated, losing their rag maybe at Red Star. But I'd still expect Bayern and Spurs to go through from that group. Atalanta, in theory, are full seeds, but I think they've got a great chance of making it out of Manchester City's group, alongside City, obviously. But I think even though they're full seeds, I'd say they're probably second favourites, actually. And then the other interesting group D, they've got Juve, Atletico and Leverkusen. One of them could well spring a surprise, I think. And the fact that Lokomotiv are there, again, a difficult place to go. They won't necessarily go through, but they could have a big bearing on who does go through if other teams visit and lose points there. Points.
You'd imagine they'd be competitive at least. I like Atalanta a lot as well. They were sort of the ones that stood out for me as a potential, not necessarily upset, but a potential team that could sneak through, that perhaps is in a traditional European sort of heavyweight that we don't see often in the last 16 of the Champions League. Gianpiero Gasperini's done a fantastic job redeveloping that team over several seasons, and given that they finished third last year, which is an underrated achievement, perhaps has gone a little bit under the radar in wider European terms in Serie A last season. They didn't really lose anyone over the summer. Signed Luis Muriel to sort of complement their strike force. I love Papu Gomez, absolutely fantastic attacking midfielder, versatile, that kind of waspish intensity he's got, very skillful, great vision, and they're a really dangerous team. They're not the type of team that need to play on the front foot. They've got a team that've got sort of different modes, and I think that's really going to suit that really sort of unusual kind of group, with trips to Shakhtar, trips to Manchester City, Dynamo Zagreb they fancy themselves against too. The only thing that counts against them, I think they're playing their home games away from their stadium, which was built in the late 20s and it's being redeveloped this year, which is such a disappointment. If you're a team like Atalanta, you get into the Champions League and you can't even play your home games at your this stadium you've been at for nearly 100 years. You have to play them at sort of almost a neutral venue. That's going to be very disappointing. If you've been to their stadium, it can be a really, really good atmosphere there. So that's one big caveat to that statement. But they could be really interesting in that latter stage of the group stages, perhaps. One thing before we move on is Bayern Munich. We talked about Bayern Munich last week. We picked out our ideal Bayern 11 and we tweeted it. So if you haven't seen it, check out the Get European Football Show Twitter feed. It's still on there, and it got a lot of play. There was a lot of contention over the left back spot, Jez. We plumped for Lucas Hernandez over David Alaba. Do we want to defend ourselves? How do you feel about it? Are we still sticking with Hernandez over Alaba at left back?
I think Alaba's free kick over the weekend weakened our argument a little bit. I suppose if you want to fit both of them into the team, then it makes sense to push Hernandez into the centre back position. And certainly a lot of the feedback we got was that the question marks over Boateng are now sort of more exclamation marks, and he should be out of the team. I'm a huge fan of what Hernandez brings as a left back, but I do understand the argument for having him and Alaba, and that's a pretty strong left side of your defence there if you have them both in there.
I would agree. I just think that if you're going to sign Hernandez, we'll talk about it later on when we talk about the Bundesliga, but it shows a little bit of, not lack of foresight, but perhaps a lack of balance to Bayern Munich's transfer policy, because it feels like they've bought Pavard and Hernandez, both perfectly capable of playing at centre-back in certain situations, but they've bought, who are the World Cup winning fullbacks, fullbacks perhaps by trade. At Lille, Pavard was moved around a lot. Okay, he's a versatile player, but was never really played in a 2 at centre-back. Play at 3, as he did at Stuttgart very, very well. And Hernandez has played a lot at centre-back for Atletico, obviously in a 2, but he's always been better, in my opinion, at left-back. So it just feels they've signed 2 fullbacks to play at centre-back in perhaps a semi kind of untried sort of position for them both. I don't know if there's that coalesces. So it makes sense for me to play Hernandez at left back. And if you're gonna pay £70 million for a guy who is a left back, he starts for me. One final word before we move on. Favourites for the Champions League? Who do you think?
I think it's got to be City. I think I would have said that the last couple of years as well, though. So not 100% sure, but surely it's time for City.
Yeah, it sounds like it, doesn't it? It feels like it.
Adam?
I think it's a really difficult question. I would lean towards Manchester City as well, but I feel Liverpool. I think Liverpool, nothing's changed since last season. For me, they're the best team in Europe. They might not be the best team in England, but they're the best team in Europe and in the Champions League. And in tighter situations, I think they've proven themselves far more capable of edging tighter games against equally sort of comparable teams than Manchester City have over the last few years. So when it gets to the quarters and the semi-finals, I'd rather play Manchester City than Liverpool, because I think Liverpool will go and beat you.
Interesting. No doubt we'll hear 7 times for the following 2 years from Liverpool fans if they do win another Champions League, a back-to-back Champions League, of course. Right, it's the Get European Football Show on Love Sport. Rich Hall is up next.
From Adams Park to Wembley, we've got it covered.
particularly well over the two games.
A couple of new signings scored for Napoli. How do you see their impact? Do you think Lozano obviously is the sort of big name one? Do you see him fitting straight into the team?
It's an interesting one. Hervin Lozano, he was on the bench, and when he came in, he had an impact because he scored Napoli's second goal on their comeback. It was an interesting one because they had a lot of different targets, with James Rodriguez, Nico Pepe. They all sort of went by the wayside, and it sort of felt like Hervin Lozano was almost sort of a last-ditch effort. He looks really bright. He'll really fit that Napoli style. It's good for them to have not just the injection of pace from the likes of Callejon and Insigne, but also to be able to bring him on. And their striking options are good as well now with the likes of Dries Mertens. Obviously, they need to get Arkadiusz Milik back, and now they've just signed Llorente in the window as well on a free. So Napoli, at the moment, I think the biggest concern would be conceding goals. I think that's something they're going to have a look at. Kostas Manolas might have got a goal in the game against Juventus, but they do look shaky at the back.
You talked about Kostas Manolas there. Is there any way Napoli might go about sort of shoring up that defence? Because they've conceded a lot of goals already this season. And we were talking about their Champions League sort of prospects just before we started chatting to you. And it'd be really great to see Napoli progress in the Champions League because they're a side of quality. Ancelotti's an experienced coach in the Champions League. It'd be brilliant to see them make some headway and really have an impact on the competition. But if they're going to keep conceding goals like this, they're not going to. How do you see that defence working out in the Champions League? Do you see prospects for Napoli in the Champions League and Juventus too, of course?
Yeah, I mean, it is early days in the season for Napoli, and I think they've always had a little, especially under Sarri originally, they always had this idea that even if they would concede some goals, they'd go at the other end and do more damage. Ancelotti talked quite a lot over the summer about shoring up that back line, and with the likes of Koulibaly and Manolas, you would think that is an improvement in the centre back positions. Their fullbacks have always been a little bit questionable. We saw Mario Rui come on at half time. And you just think that potentially that's somewhere where they fail to upgrade. Now, whether that costs them long term, I think Ancelotti will do work with this team. I think they will get better. Fiorentina surprised them. There was a lot of hoo-ha, should we say, around that opening game with Fiorentina because of the new owner, a lot of enthusiasm because of Frank Ribery. And I think that was just a crazy game. And this one again, I can't see this happening every week with Napoli, and I think they will get better in the season. But it's not what they want straight from the off, and like I said, it does need work.
We talked about this one being a goal-tastic match. Another one that on paper wasn't so exciting, but in practice arguably was the Rome derby. It finished 1-1, but I think the woodwork was hit maybe 5-6 times. 6 times, yeah. It could easily have been 4-3 as well. Roma have obviously brought in Smalling, so I'm not sure they're looking to shore up their defence much. Are either of them going to challenge for titles or trophies or European places this season?
It's an interesting one. I mean, Roma have just brought in Mkhitaryan as well, just right at the death in the window tonight, and so they are looking still to improve this team. I think they're a work in progress under Fonseca. He was trying to get his ideas across, and I don't think he's got his complete team he wants. He's not really got James Pilotta to part with as much money as he probably wanted to in this window. I think the biggest thing for them is Pau Lopez in goal is a massive upgrade on Olsen, who had an absolutely disastrous season last season. And I suppose that's a bit unfair in some respects because we're comparing him to the likes of Alisson before and Wojciech Szczesny, who improved so much in Rome that there's always now the myth of the Roma goalkeeping coaches and what they can do. I think, as I said, they will take some time to build on it, but there's some bright sparks. The likes they've upgraded in defence with Mancini coming in. Zaniolo's always looking to improve. I think the disappointing thing for them probably was the fact that Justin Kluivert looks like he's regressing rather than progressing. So, as I said, I think they could probably still make the Europa League. Especially now the window's shut pretty much now, I'm pretty excited about Lazio. I think that they, with the likes of Carrera and Mobley, are just a really, really attacking team, lots of pace, and that midfield with Milinkovic-Savic, Lucas Leiva holding, and especially Luis Alberto, who for me, it was just majestic again. He really just drops in between the lines so well, and he's so creative. So I think, and it's no surprise that the week before, Luis Alberto got 2 assists for Carrera and Immobile, and obviously he got the equaliser again against Rome. So that's always a big crazy game. I think Lazio came out of it the better. You're right. 6 times the post was hit, 4 by Lazio, twice by Roma. It could have been another crazy game. But yeah, it's the woodwork that saved it.
Yeah, that Lazio midfield is really interesting. Not the best season for them last season, but form of 2 seasons ago, particularly Luis Alberto and Milinkovic-Savic were absolutely fantastic, and there's a lot of potential there. One team that perhaps aren't fulfilling their potential this season, looking slightly further down the table from last year, managerless, well, not managerless, but they lost their manager over the summer. Sampdoria, obviously a big club as well. Marco Giampaolo going to AC Milan. A 4-1 defeat, 3-0 down at half-time to Sassuolo. It looks like it's going to be a tough season for them, doesn't it?
I think it is. They've not really enforced as much as they should. And as much as, for me, the over-reliance on Fabio Quagliarella. You know, the guy's going to be 37 soon, I think he's 36 or 37. And whilst he was Capocannoniere last season, he was so good. He was so good last season, should I say. That he, and he produces things out of nowhere. They can't just keep relying on him non-stop. The likes of Murillo, who came in at the back, I don't really see that as a huge upgrade. And now they're seeing players like the Englishman, Ronaldo Vieira, thrown into a midfield, because obviously they've lost the likes of Anderson and Pratt, which is unfortunate. So I think they have been weakened, and you're right, their coach has departed for pastures new in Milan. But again, Di Francesco is a good coach, and it will take time. The irony was that Di Francesco used to coach Sassuolo, and they did get just completely turned over because, unbelievably, Domenico Berardi, who's one of the most frustrating players in Italy, just because of his professionalism and application, he doesn't always turn it on when he should. He turned it on, and he was absolutely brilliant, as we know he can be. So I think it will be a tough season for Sampdoria.
The transfer window obviously closing in a couple of hours. Some really big incoming into Serie A, aside from Smalling. Who do you see as the sort of star attraction, the biggest transfer into Serie A this summer?
Well, it's interesting. Just on one thing that's interesting me today, especially as well, two transfers. One, just because it's so nostalgic, and this isn't a big one that's going to affect anything, by the way, but I just love the fact that Sandro Matri is now teamed up with Balotelli at Brescia. That just feels like that. It would have been brilliant 10 years ago. Something along those lines. But one of the biggest one, I think, that's just probably gone a bit under the radar today is I'm quite impressed with some of the work that Milan have been doing under the radar. Everyone knew they were involved in a rebuild. It's going to be difficult for them. But Ante Rebic has joined Milan on a 2-year loan from Frankfurt. And Andre Silva, who they never really managed to get a tune of apart from one illustrious run in the Europa League, has gone the other way. I think that they are building a really good young team. And I know it wasn't the best start for them. In fact, they had quite a terrible opening game. But at the same point, that was quite a good one to see go over the line today, because they do need extra up front. I also quite like the idea that Simone Verdi joined Torino today from Napoli. I think that's an absolutely fantastic signing for them. But also as well, I suppose the big news in Italy today is just all surrounding Mauro Icardi.
Absolutely. Many transfers there to keep an eye on. Rich Hall of Football Italia, thank you very much.
Cheers, guys.
Jed, should we do Icardi very briefly now? We're going to talk to Jonathan Johnson about him and his incoming, his move to PSG. Your thoughts?
I feel like we've mentioned Icardi and Neymar every week for the last 6 weeks. Again, I don't think there's any doubting that Icardi's an excellent striker, clinical striker, and certainly with Cavani seeming to have more and more injury niggles, a really useful addition to the PSG squad. It's just, as everyone says, the concerns are sort of ego, both on and off the pitch, I think. And I can't remember who it was. Someone posted a great tweet today of a commentator saying penalty for PSG, and then they had the clip of the sort of Mexican standoff, the good, the bad, and the ugly, with Neymar, Cavani, and Icardi all fighting for the ball. I think that's kind of the potential issue. There's going to be some big egos there vying for sort of supremacy. But if somehow Tuchel can get them all working in the same direction and, being willing to take a match on the bench and give themselves a breather and someone else a chance, then that's a really strong attack who could work really well to PSG's advantage. But they're big ifs.
They are big ifs. Well said, Jeremy Smith. It's the Get European Football Show on Love Sport.
This is Love Sport.
Matches in March, April for them. Obviously, the aim is that they stay in all the trophies, all the competitions for as long as possible. And I think any team with the best will in the world has to be able to rotate nowadays to be able to give these top players a breather. Mbappe, as great as he looked, sort of shouldering the responsibility last year for 50 odd matches, you can't carry on doing that season in, season out, especially at his age. He's going to burn out quickly. Obviously an international tournament coming up in the summer as well that hopefully he'll be playing in. So I think that Tuchel ideally would like to have 4 or 5 top players vying for places in that attack.
Angel Di Maria's there too, of course. He's been brilliant for sort of a year or so.
Yeah, often he generally plays a lot better when Neymar isn't playing as well. So maybe that's an automatic swap there that Tuchel doesn't have to think too much about. But I can't see how they can all fit in the same team. You could have sort of Neymar sitting behind the other 3, but I just think it's a little bit too much. And as we've spoken about numerous times before, the problem with PSG often hasn't been the going forward. It's been the what's going on behind there. And as great as it would be to see all 4 of them starting, it means that there's going to be a little bit less emphasis on the defensive side, and that's where PSG slip up. It might be that the decision's made for them when players like Cavani maybe are out with injury, but the ideal would be for Tuchel to be able to rotate and for everyone to be happy to be part of that rotation.
Indeed, it certainly is a bit of a conundrum. And to discuss that conundrum is Jonathan Johnson of ESPN. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey there, guys. Thanks a lot for having me on.
No problem at all. We've been discussing Icardi before and after the break. Where are we at with that impending transfer, and where do you see him fitting in? How does this Icardi plus PSG work? What do we get from that relationship?
Well, the transfer deal is very close to being official. I mean, you can expect it any minute now. My understanding is that it's a loan with an option to buy. We're waiting for news on whether or not Icardi's contract has been extended with Inter Milan, which was the idea earlier today. And basically, what I think is, the thinking behind this move is that PSG have identified a good opportunity in Icardi. Albeit one with a fair amount of risk, given everything that Icardi kind of brings with him off the pitch. But when he's on the pitch and when he's focused, he is a lethal striker. And there are few players that I can think of off the top of my head who are more complete and would be sort of more ideal than he is to potentially replace Edinson Cavani from next summer. And getting him on loan with an option to buy and not an obligation would be absolutely perfect for PSG, because they could test him out, see how he does, and then potentially add him on a permanent basis next year. Whether or not PSG are going to be able to keep Neymar, Mbappe and Icardi together sort of long term, it might just be a one season thing. It certainly seems like Barcelona will come back in for Neymar in 12 months time. We're just going to have to wait and see how this season pans out for PSG. But in terms of the attack, it is quite often the case with PSG anyway, particularly when Cavani was in better physical condition. You can't see many better teams going forward in Europe. The question is how much more solid the midfield's going to be with these new additions that have been made over the summer, and what the defence is going to be like, particularly now with a new goalkeeper in Keylor Navas, behind that, behind that back four or back three, however Tuchel wants to send them out in different matches.
You mentioned Navas there. Obviously, he's come in with Areola going the other way. I know you feel strongly about how Areola's been maybe treated by PSG, but do you see that as a positive move overall for the Parisians?
I see clarity in the goalkeeping position being a positive thing for PSG. I had hoped that clarity would come with Areola being given one season as undisputed number one, but it seemed like there were a lot of people that were never really convinced that was something that should happen. I find it a shame, although I do look at the Areola deal, with him going to Real Madrid, on loan until the end of the season, as something that could potentially still work out in PSG's favour. He still could come back and potentially, take back over from Navas at some point in the future. We'll just have to wait and see how that one plays out. I think this move benefits PSG more than it does Areola, and I think that had it been earlier in the transfer window and this opportunity had come along, I'm not so sure Areola would have jumped at it, but I think it's probably been made quite clear to him that he would be number two, and it was just a happy coincidence that Real Madrid would be looking for somebody to compete with Courtois up until the end of the season, which would give it gave him the potential of a change of air. And he wouldn't have to suffer the ignominy of being relegated to the bench once again. With another big name goalkeeper coming in. I mean, I think if it works out as is planned, Navas could give PSG a real boost in the Champions League this season. However, I don't agree with this idea that Areola was PSG's biggest, weakest link all along, and I still think that the proof of the pudding is going to be in the eating with PSG, and that's going to come, like you mentioned before I even came on, round about March time, because PSG's real weakness over the last couple of seasons has been their collective mentality, and I don't think it's just going to be the addition of a Navas or an Icardi that makes the difference there. It's going to be all of the summer additions that PSG have made, so the likes of Ander Herrera, Idrissa Gueye, Abdou Diallo, all of those guys, and how they pull together with the PSG squad that's remaining from last season, and make a better fist of the Champions League than they did last time around.
Absolutely. It's really interesting to see how that squad pulls together in more general terms, because we talked a lot about the potential removal of Neymar from that squad situation, but we know now that he's not going to Barcelona and that he should stay. A Spanish newspaper sort of referred to it as the repatriation of Neymar. How do PSG go about reintroducing him into their squad and reintroducing him into their team? Because he's obviously got a somewhat strained relationship with Leonardo. We've seen quotes in the French press of Leonardo being quite forthright with him about learning French with the squad in general. The team and the manager have managed to stay relatively neutral. They've continually said that they want Neymar to stay and they see him as their best player. But his relationship with the fans and perhaps even the media is a little bit more estranged. How does Neymar go from this player that would want to move on, go back to Barcelona, to being the fulcrum of this Paris Saint-Germain team again?
I think the biggest challenge for Neymar in terms of reintegrating at PSG won't come with the players or the staff. I think it'll actually come with the fans. Interestingly, PSG's Ultras account branded a report earlier today fake news, and the report was claiming that PSG had already initiated meetings with the Ultras to discuss the way that they would behave towards Neymar when he is reintegrated into the side. That's expected to happen from the end of the international break. So PSG's first match back after the internationals is Strasbourg at home in Lyon, which would be quite ironic considering that it's against Strasbourg that Neymar got injured, and Strasbourg have a coach, Thierry Loret, who's very very open about the fact that he wants his players to be physical when they come up against players of Neymar's quality. So PSG's players, especially some of the main stars, the likes of Mbappe, the likes of Verratti, have all been very, very open and clear with the fact that they maintain very good relationships with Neymar individually. And he's always, a popular figure when they're doing collective training sessions. Certainly when I've been in attendance since the beginning of the season, he's always quite happy, quite smiley with his teammates. The Leonardo relationship has warmed up, or it seems to have warmed up a little bit in the last couple of weeks. Leonardo now a bit more positive about Neymar than he was at the very beginning of his return as sporting director. Obviously, you'd assume that there's still a long way to go before those bridges are completely mended. But I think that Tuchel has been absolutely, massively behind Neymar ever since the beginning of all of this. He's never wavered in the fact that he hoped that Neymar would stay, and still plans, for him to play a big part for PSG. And I actually think that Neymar staying is a huge boost for Tuchel, because, in my opinion, one of the issues that PSG have had since the beginning of this season is the fact that Neymar hasn't been around, and the fact that Tuchel's idea, his vision for PSG when he came in, revolved heavily around Neymar.
Leonardo gave an interesting interview after one of the matches this week, and it was the second time this summer that he's kind of ridden back on expectations for PSG this year. He said they're not going to be a bling club this season, and while they sort out some of the kind of financial structures, it's going to be a difficult season, I think he said. But then at the same time, as you mentioned, this could be the sort of one and only season with all of those players up front. Real obviously going to make an assault for Mbappe next year. Neymar, Barca maybe again for Neymar. What would be a reasonable season for PSG, not looking domestically, but in terms of Champions League? Are they realistic contenders, or just further than the last couple of years would be good enough?
I mean, a team that's able to put the likes of Neymar, the likes of Mbappe, the likes of Icardi, the likes of Cavani, Di Maria, you name it, on the pitch. They're always going to be in the discussion as potential Champions League, winning material. However, I think first things first, PSG need to get over this mental hurdle that they've sort of constructed by themselves over the last couple of years, and that they can't even seem to get past the round of 16 these days. I think if they can jump that and get into the quarterfinals, then I'd say that they stand a big chance, especially as belief will be much higher. Once they get past that, to make it potentially into the semis and beyond. Obviously a lot in the Champions League depends on the way that the draw goes after the group stage. Looking at the group, I mean, we've said this about PSG so many times in the past. PSG need to be tested early on in the Champions League. So I think coming up against Real Madrid early on, especially in the first game, to be playing that at home. We saw how it worked in PSG's favour a couple of years ago when they drew Barcelona in the group stage, ended up beating them 3-2. So, PSG, will be very motivated for that opening match. And I also think it's good to have, some quite testing or potentially testing trips, or particularly with the Galatasaray away in mind. That has a bit of history as well for those who've known PSG for longer than since the Qatari takeover. So there's going to be plenty of needles to those two games. So I think that Champions League group stage is set up to be quite a test for PSG, and I think that's good because that's what they need, to take them into the round of 16. Then we'll see who they draw. But I think, what Leonardo was getting at with those comments was, trying to get people to temper their expectations and not keep saying, this team's got to win the Champions League sometime soon, because PSG have been paying for that, those claims by the by their Qatari owners, pretty much for the last couple of years, because Nasser Al-Khelaifi, when he came in, said, we're going to be aiming to win the Champions League within 5 years of the takeover. Okay, so they got to 2016, they hadn't gotten past the quarterfinals, and suddenly, getting that far, 4 consecutive quarterfinal appearances, was suddenly not good enough. When actually it was more than adequate. You could say even that they were ahead of schedule at that point. So, I think Leonardo is right to try and temper things a little bit. But I do think that there is an element of truth in it as well, in that he is trying to construct a new PSG behind the scenes. And there will be teething issues from time to time. But any team that can put out players of the quality of Neymar, Mbappe, obviously they are going to be, potential Champions League winning material. A lot just depends on, what happens after the group stage.
Brilliant stuff. Jonathan Johnson of ESPN. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, guys. Speak soon.
That was Jonathan Johnson of ESPN, and this is the Get European Football Show on Love Sport.
If you mess with the USA, I guarantee there'll be hell to pay.
For the fans, by the fans, Love Sport Radio.
Hi, my name's Kurt Edwards. I work in advertising and live in Surrey. Last year, the family content insurance was £745. A friend of mine had recommended a spokesmansaid.com when it came for this year's renewal.
when he's on the top of his game as he is just now, there are few players in European football or world football who are more dangerous. He's very reminiscent in his style of play of the Jamie Vardy that we saw in the season where Leicester won the Premier League. He has that threat at any moment that he will break away from the defensive line. And we saw that against Gladbach at the weekend. Time and time again, Leipzig were managing to draw Gladbach out a little bit into a more high defensive line, and that just created space in behind. And as soon as Leipzig were able to access that space for Werner, his acceleration was absolutely out of this world. But it's more than that with Werner. We've seen often enough now that he's also a very calm and composed finisher when he gets in these areas. It's all very well to be a player who's blessed with explosive speed or great strength or aerial ability, but you have to be able to capitalise on the chances when they come to you. And Werner's 3 finishes at the weekend just really bore that. Each time he was through on goal, you had no doubt in your mind that he was going to finish, and he did so very well. I think that Lewandowski is still the most complete forward in the Bundesliga, but I would certainly have Werner not that far behind him.
Absolutely, he's an absolutely fantastic player. Great to watch as well. With the transfer window coming to a close, it'd really be interesting to get your thoughts on sort of the comparative strategies between Borussia Dortmund and Bayern Munich. It's something we discussed a little bit on the show before, but there seems to be a rather big sort of disconnect between one and the other. Dortmund getting their business done really early, and Bayern waiting till very late in the window and perhaps having a little bit more erratic kind of transfer policy. Who do you see as coming out of the summer window as better off?
I think that when we look at it at the end of the season, I think there's no doubt in my mind that Dortmund will be the better offside in terms of transfer dealings. I listened to the show last week when you were discussing the Bayern 11 that you would pick, and it was evident just from that conversation that it's very, very difficult to decide exactly where their strengths lie in each position. That's even after they've recruited over the course of a transfer window. I think Dortmund were very quick, as they always are in a transfer window. That's something we've come to expect from them. They sealed the deals for Julian Brandt, for Thorgan Hazard and for Nico Schultz very quickly. Only Mats Hummels really broke with that when he came later on the window in terms of their dealings for the first team, as it were. But then when you look at Bayern, apart from Jean-Peter Arp and Havard and Hernandez, who were already finished, really, then to sign Coutinho, Perisic and Cuisance so late in the window, so late in the day, it just feels like a team that, or a squad, for example, that wasn't really thought out in terms of the recruitment. You have to have a plan, and you have to have your idea of where your squad balance is in terms of depth, in terms of age profile, in terms of the systems that you're going to play. You have to have it all planned out before you start. And it just feels like Bayern threw money at the problem at the end of the window without really putting thought into it. So personally, I think that Dortmund will come out on top in the long term.
Brilliant stuff. Lee Scott of Total Football Analysis. Really interesting insight. Thanks very much.
That was Lee Scott, yes, of Total Football Analysis. This is the Get European Football Show on Love Sport. We'll be back in a moment.
This is Love Sport. Can you save money on your energy bills? Tony did, with help from a spokesman.
Love Sport Radio with the guys from Get Football, Adam White and Jeremy Smith. Don't forget we are streaming live on YouTube. Just search Get European Football Show on YouTube and you'll see the two with a lovely stadium backdrop behind them. Right, chaps,
Indeed.
on to La Liga.
Is it the Maracanã behind us? Is that?
I believe it is resembling the Maracanã. It may well be the Maracanã, yes.
Indeed. My first trip to the Maracanã here in the Love Sport studio.
There you go.
Absolutely. We're going to move on to Serie A. We've done Serie A. We're going to move on to La Liga for the final part of the show. We're also going to be discussing the closing transfer window across the continent in the final part of the show. Also, before we move on to talk to Chris from Marca, Jez, there's a lot of talk about Ivan Rakitic potentially moving to PSG as part of the sort of outgoing Neymar deal. Do you think that's a sign that PSG will come back to? Is that a type of player that they need in their squad? Do you see him fitting in there, or is it sort of a product of circumstance? Because it seemed like Barcelona was sort of throwing any player that they decided they weren't too keen on anymore at Paris Saint-Germain and hoping they would bite.
I think it probably is circumstance. I think if you just look at the start of the window, before they brought in any other midfielders, I'd have said Rakitic was probably a very clever signing. They need more in the centre there. Certainly good experience for all the criticism that he seems to get now from Barcelona fans. He's been there, he's done that, World Cup finalist, multiple trophy winner with Barcelona, possibly exactly the kind of versatile midfielder that PSG could have done with. But having brought in Gay, having brought in Herrera, Sarabia, who can sort of push to the centre if need be, I don't think they do need him. And yeah, it did feel more like it was just purely a sort of make way in any prospective Neymar deal.
Indeed, a number of Spanish connections at PSG. And our Spanish connection for the next 10 or 15 minutes or so is Chris Winterburn of Marca. Hi there, Chris.
Hi guys, how are we doing?
Very good, thanks. Thanks for coming back on the show. A really interesting weekend in La Liga this weekend. Barcelona, first of all, we'll start with them. An interesting 2-2 draw away at El Sadar. A very difficult place to go in Osasuna. What happened to Barcelona? They were leading 2-1 but conceded a late penalty. And Ansu Fati, the 16-year-old that got his debut last week, got his goal. And it was quite some goal in the end, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. And I think the problem Barcelona have had is when you win back-to-back titles, the intensity sort of drops. And I think we're seeing that from Barcelona. It's like, yes, they're missing Messi. But I think this weekend it was more a case of, Osasuna were resilient and played off a really atmospheric crowd at a stadium that has missed top-flight football, but they weren't that great. And I think Barcelona, it was more about them being poor and sloppy when they had the ball in dangerous areas than anything the host did well.
I saw a stat that said that Ter Stegen had more touches during the match than Griezmann. It's been a sort of up and down start for him. Obviously, a fantastic Nou Camp debut last week, but quiet first week, and obviously not so great this weekend. Is he struggling with the pressure of leading the line with everyone else injured, or was it just one of those matches?
I think it's just one of those matches, and I don't think he's necessarily suited to leading the line on his own, certainly not in a Barcelona team. We saw him do it a lot at Atletico Madrid before they re-signed Diego Costa, and it was never quite his strength, even if perhaps his best goal-scoring years came in that period. I think when Barcelona bought Griezmann, I think it was much more a case of to complement Messi and to maybe take some of the pressure off Suarez in terms of goals. I don't think they ever sort of envisaged him leading the line on a too regular basis without the other pairing alongside him. And I think we're seeing maybe some of the drawbacks of Griezmann's overall game when he's asked to do it all himself.
Indeed, it does feel a little bit like that. We talked a lot about Neymar over the course of the show, and you mentioned Antoine Griezmann there. 2 big transfers, but one transfer that was a little bit overshadowed, never really got going over the course of the summer, was Gareth Bale. What's the situation now with Bale? Because he was going to leave, he was completely exiled from the squad, he's been brought back, and he scored twice at the weekend and got himself sent off in a 2-2 draw for Real Madrid. Is he now back in the team? Is he now first choice? Does Zidane rely on him as one of his sort of stalwart players? And how did he get himself sent off? 2 yellow cards in injury time, was it?
It was. They weren't really. It was frustrating because he now misses the next match, obviously. But they didn't really impact the outcome of the match. It wasn't necessarily one of those things you see from a forward where it's a silly challenge, they go flying in. It was 2 innocuous yellows, and you maybe could have argued that on another day, with that time left in the match, the referee might have just said, OK, 1 yellow, that'd be enough. But I've characterised this sort of as an uncomfortable resumption of working relations between Bale and Zidane. It's clear that nobody wanted it to end this way this summer. Gareth Bale, whilst he wanted to stay at Real Madrid, didn't want to stay working for Zidane, and Zidane didn't want Bale to stay at Real Madrid. So I think no one's really got what they wanted as the transfer window closes. But Madrid are struggling at the minute. They're lacking players through injuries. Then Vinicius Jr., nobody quite knows the situation with him, why his form has dropped off so much. So Gareth Bale, in a way, nobody could have predicted, has sort of been catapulted back into that almost undroppable position at Real Madrid.
Staying with Real Madrid, we mentioned the Areola-Navas kind of swap deal earlier on in a PSG context. How's it viewed at Real Madrid? Is it kind of, well, it's just one substitute keeper for another, it's not big news, or is this seen as a positive transfer?
Well, the fans love Keylor Navas. Whether he's been possibly the best goalkeeper in the world at any point in his career, that's a debate for another day, but he's certainly achieved a lot at Real Madrid, and the fans have really, really taken to him. He's played well. It was only really the last 18 months before Courtois arrived that the mistakes started creeping into his game. But I think everyone sort of knew this was coming. It wasn't sustainable to have two high-quality goalkeepers battling for one position. Keylor Navas wasn't going to be happy just playing cup games. And Thibaut Courtois, you sort of feel after an up-and-down debut season, was going to need that message of, you're our guy, there's no issues here, you're going to play most, if not every game. And I think it was always a move that was going to come, although the swap involving Areola has come as somewhat as a surprise. I think for him, it's a risk in a European Championship year, even if Hugo Lloris is France's undisputed number one. But he might not play a lot of football, so I think it's certainly a risk from his perspective.
In general, obviously, there's been some big transfers within La Liga. Griezmann we've spoken about. I guess Hazard and Felix are a couple of the others. What do you see as the kind of the big standout signing of the summer?
Big standout signing, it's difficult. I'm going to have to go with Griezmann to Barcelona just because of the fee, the quality of player they're getting. Also, João Felix. But if you were to ask me the signing that I thought was perhaps the most interesting and the most beneficial to a team, I love Kieran Trippier going to Atletico Madrid. I mean, where do you take a talented fullback who's got clear defensive deficiencies to the team with the best defensive coaching setup in world football? I'm really intrigued to see how this works out because he could be a real wild card in that team. He's quick, takes a wonderful set piece, and he could improve defensively. And whilst he's on the wrong side of 25, you're not going to get a long, sustained period of him. If he improves defensively, like Simeone's already suggested he's working on doing, you could get a really good player there for 2 or 3 years.
Sticking with Atletico and that defensive side, Thomas Lemar obviously he is a World Cup winner, but his sort of progress stagnated a little bit while he was at Monaco, and moving to Atletico seemed like it was going to be make or break for him. How's he done? And certainly from the defensive point of view, which wasn't his strength, has Simeone improved that side of things?
Certainly, there was a lot of. You've got to remember, he arrived at Atletico without a proper pre-season. That's something people forget. He'd been part of the World Cup winning squad despite not playing too many minutes. And so he arrived, didn't have a proper pre-season, then got thrust into a team that was expected to win everything, let's not forget. The Champions League final was in their own stadium. And I think the pressure sort of took the team and he never really settled. But this pre-season he's worked incredibly hard, excuse me, and he's certainly a lot better at tracking back. His defensive work is a lot more diligent now. And I think Simeone is beginning to trust him. I think we're going to see him in the team a lot this season. And if he gets the defensive side, not every time, not focusing mainly on defending, but if he tracks back, if he does his work properly and then gets the space to shine and play his natural game further forward, I think we're really going to see the player, not as flamboyant as we saw at Monaco because it's a different system, but we're going to certainly see an effective player in the Atletico team.
Sevilla only drew at the weekend, but they've obviously had a very strong start to the season. With Barcelona looking slightly shaky, Real Madrid having sort of I guess I was going to say growing pains, but difficulties integrating some of these new players, whether it's injuries or other issues. Can Sevilla mount a realistic challenge to those two, and to Atletico obviously as well?
It's always dangerous to be blunt, but I'm going to have to say no. They've started well. They've done strong business. Let's don't get me wrong, but I think talk of the title challenge is quite premature. I don't think the quality's there. Simple as that. I think it's important not to get sucked in by the number of deals done by Monchi this summer, and you've got to remember to look at quality over quantity. These players that they brought in aren't near the level needed for a serious title challenge. If you were to put them up man for man against Barcelona, you would struggle to take many that you say you'd swap. And whilst that's a difficult barometer because Barcelona are an excellent team, I think it does show that they aren't near the level needed for a serious title challenge. And you've got to remember there's been far better Monchi built teams that have fallen short than the current group. I think this season's more about re-establishing a playing style and returning to the Champions League. I don't think they can look too much further ahead than that.
Indeed. One final question on La Liga, and looking at the bottom of the table, Leganés, one of my they've definitely got the best nickname of any team in Europe. With is it Papaneros? Is that the cucumber growers? I think. The bottom of the table, they're a small team that have done really well in La Liga to maintain their position in the top tier of Spanish football, despite being a very, very small club. But 3 losses in a row, bottom of the table. Do you see them as being in trouble this season?
I think personally, I find it difficult to make too big a judgment this early on because they've had awful results. But you've got to remember they've played 2 really good teams in Atleti and Real Betis, and they actually haven't lost any of these 3 games by more than a single goal. So whilst the signs aren't great results-wise, there's still a lot to think maybe they're going to be too good to go down, although that's obviously never a good phrase to use. But you look at the coach, Mauricio Pellegrino, and the players, I think it's more a bad start than anything. I don't think it's a sign of deeper-rooted problems. I think they will be there or thereabouts in the relegation battle, but I don't think that they're going to slip. I think they'll probably find the form and improve, but it doesn't get any easier, does it, after the international break? They play Villarreal. The only worry I would have is where the goal's going to come from, because Guido Carrillo was hardly prolific last year with 6 in 32, so that would be my one worry.
Indeed. Chris Winterburn of Marca, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Brilliant stuff. Jez, looking at this La Liga table, do you see Sevilla and Atletico as genuine title challengers? Because I think at the last time Atletico won their first 3 games, it was the last time they won the league, I think. Do you see them as not favourites, but genuine contenders?
I think for Sevilla, I agree with Chris. I think they've had quite a big turnover, a great start. They've got a quality coach, who obviously sort of mucked up his own career a little bit last season, but is looking stronger now. And I think that they'll have a strong season, but I can't see them as title contenders. But Atletico, I don't see why not. Simeone's done it before. I do feel that Barcelona and Real Madrid are both going through somewhat of a transition phase, as in a way Atletico obviously were losing their star player, but I think they've obviously reinvested a lot of that money into João Felix. He's already fitted straight into the team, already got a couple of goals, is combining well with the likes of Diego Costa. So I think that there could be less of an adjustment period for Atletico as there might be for some areas of the Barcelona and Real Madrid teams. And so, yeah, I really think that they could challenge them all the way.
Indeed, a really interesting title race in La Liga. I think it's a really interesting league. It's really got the capabilities for upsets. There are so many difficult places to go. Teams at home are often very strong. When you get a slightly weaker Real Madrid or Barcelona, then it becomes an extremely competitive league very, very quickly. And you're seeing that this season with Barcelona's results and Atletico and Real Madrid results. So it could be a really fantastic title race. Even last season we saw some what you consider less fashionable teams doing really well. Getafe are really unfortunate not to make the top 4 under Jose Bordalas, who's a really interesting coach. Finally got his chance in La Liga, having been close before, sacked as Alaves were promoted, and really sort of unusual looking coach, very sort of manicured beard and very sort of hipster looking glasses. A really interesting chap with a team of players made up of from all over the league and from the lower divisions and older players, sort of unwanted players, if you like, and they're absolutely fantastic and we're really competitive. It'd be interesting to see how they do in the Europa League this year. Just 2 bits of big breaking news. One in particular for Jez is that Florian Andoni has left Brighton and that Mauro Icardi has indeed signed for PSG. So some really interesting transfers ahead for the last. It's not the last. We're very early on in the season for the next sort of month before the next international break. But I'm sure we'll discuss them all again.
I'm sure you will after this, in fact, because you're going to be looking at those Twitter feeds on Get Football.
Love Sport. Love Sport Breakfast with Richard Lee and Patrick Christys.
You give a load of facts and then you go and give a wild prediction that's so horribly wrong every single day.
Rich, I'll admit freely, I'll hold my hands up and say I just misunderstood the away goals rule. Fine, mate, but it doesn't make me a total idiot.
Final quarter of an hour, Adam. It's tweet time.
It is indeed. We're going to be looking at the Get Football Twitter feeds. GGFN_ for Get German Football News, GFFN for Get French Football News, and _GIFN for Get Italian Football News. Now, looking down the list of potential transfers and transfers that have gone through over the last few hours, the Bundesliga window obviously closed a little bit early this afternoon at 5. Serie A closed at 7 o'clock, and La Liga and Ligue 1 have got about 40 minutes left until their window closes. We've talked a lot about Neymar. We've just mentioned that Mauro Icardi has completed his move to PSG. He'll be wearing the number 18 shirt, posing there at the PSG training ground. We talked Areola. Alexis Sanchez to Inter Milan is the next one on my list. I think it's a really interesting one because the drop-off between his Arsenal form and his Manchester United form was massive. Can he, under Antonio Conte, we talked a lot about Antonio Conte over the course of the show, potentially a very pragmatic coach, gets the best out of his teams, finds ways to win tight games. Is Sanchez the right fit there?
I think he could be. I think it was clearly time for a change, and possibly that was one of Wenger's best sort of parting gifts to Arsenal, was just getting rid of Alexis Sanchez at the right time, and certainly at United it never really happened, and more than that, it sounded like he was beginning to be a bit of a disruptive influence in the changing room. So I think it's definitely time for him to move, and obviously returning to Italy and not the same club obviously, but that was where he sort of first made his name. I think could be a move for him. I think Conte is the type of coach that is certainly going to get him to buck his ideas up, and it will go one way or the other. Hopefully he'll be able to refine some form. I think he could fit into that team, into sort of maybe kind of sitting back, being strong defensively, and then fast breaking, and ironically combining again with Lukaku. There's, as long as he hasn't sort of burned out, I think that the type of player he is, it's possible that he may just be a busted flush now. But there's there was a fantastic player there, and if you can find anything close to his best form, then I think it will turn out to be a very good move for Inter.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It was fantastic in Serie A the first time, and obviously a lot has happened since then with various moves. But that Udinese team under Francesco Guidolin with Toto Di Natale, I'm surprised it's taken 7 shows for me to say anything about Toto Di Natale. What an absolute legend he was. Absolutely fantastic. Next, one from GIFN, Get Italian Football News, is Patrick Schick to Red Bull Leipzig. Do you think Leipzig need any more strikers? Would you be happy if you were Timo Werner? We talked a lot about Werner over the course of the show. He's clearly the main man there. Lee Scott from Total Football Analysis is very complimentary of him. Does Patrick Schick get a game at Leipzig, or do you see him as a sort of with a busy season to come? You know, the Champions League commitments are going to look to get out of that group that we talked about earlier on, very tight group. Is he sort of merely a make weight, or do you expect him to have an impact?
I'd have thought more as backup, and again, a quality player who maybe hasn't quite matched the hype that surrounded him when he first appeared on the scene.
Yeah,
so
he was great at Sampdoria when he got through, for sure.
Exactly, yeah. So possibly also time for a move and a change of scenery. I think Leipzig's attack at the moment is working very well. Has been consistent for the last couple of years as well. And there's even players like Nkunku and Lookman who aren't absolute goal scorers, but also can add to the attack, who've come in this summer. So I think that there's a lot of competition there, but the profile that Schick has, I think, gives us a slightly different option to some of the others that are there. But I'd still say certainly back up to Werner for the moment.
Yeah, with Lee, we were talking a lot earlier about the sort of varying systems that Julian Nagelsmann uses. You imagine there's potential for him to play through the middle. He could theoretically play wide as well. You've got Poulsen there as well, who's a very good forward, was with them in Bundes 2 and did a very good job, and has stayed at the club throughout. Looking a bit further down those Twitter feeds, Nice start to appear quite a lot on Get French Football News. We didn't get a chance to discuss Nice with Jonathan Johnson earlier, but the takeover deal of Jim Ratcliffe has gone through, and they've had a very sort of very busy end to the transfer window in France. Nice.
Yeah, it was kind of best things come to those who wait, I guess. There was a time when it looked like this deal was. The takeover deal was going to happen so late that there wouldn't be any time to bring anyone in, but they've actually really made up for lost time in the last week or so, and made some pretty exciting signings. They've got Nsocki, who was being chased by quite a few teams in the Premier League and across France as well.
Yeah, Newcastle have linked with him at one point.
Yeah, and then I think both Marseille and Lyon have also made plays for him, and Monaco as well, I think. So that's a great coup for Nice to bring him in as a less-sided defender, and although defence has been Nice's strong point over the last season and 4 games, they were down to the sort of bare bones at the weekend, so they definitely need to strengthen in that department. They've brought in Alexis Claude Maurice as an attacking midfielder, winger, or as number 10, who both West Ham and Arsenal were after. They've brought in Bouadi, who 19-year-old who won the African Cup of Nations during the summer and is quite friendly with Youssef Attal, as is Adam Unas, who they've brought in from Napoli. So really a good handful of players, and also Kasper Dolberg from Ajax, who started brilliantly, but again, also sort of plateaued a bit, and maybe it was the time for a change for him, and he's coming in still young, still with a lot to prove. So it's going to be fascinating to see. Vieira did a brilliant job last year with absolutely no attack and just based on the strong defence. It's going to be great to see what he can do with a really full balanced squad this year.
Yeah, absolutely. I think perhaps the biggest signing for Nice this window isn't necessarily an on-field one. It's the potential return of the former president Jean-Pierre Rivière and his right-hand man Fournier, who is not Julien Fournier. Julien Fournier.
Yeah.
Who's with Hubert Fournier, used to manage Lyon. They're fantastic managers of the club, and they did a brilliant job in not just sort of investing in the club, but scouting and really building a really interesting squad, and were very successful in saying those players on, stood by their various managers over the course of their spell at the club, very closely connected to Patrick Vieira, who we've been saying on previous editions of the show that did a really good job at Nice last year, despite minimal resources and a bit of chaos above him at the club after those two left previously. How important are they continued success of Nice, because Nice were title challengers at one stage with them in charge, and obviously with previous coaches. They were that season they finished third when Monaco won the league. They were fantastic. Is there a potential return for that? Maybe not this year, but going forward.
I actually thought that Ganago, who was there in between the two kind of regimes of Riviere and Fournier, did a decent enough job as well. But certainly they're the two that oversaw Nice really moving to a new stadium and developing some real stability in terms of constant success. The problem with Nice, as it is with a lot of French teams, is that there's a big turnaround of players. So every time they discover a Mendy or a Seri or kind of a revitalised Ben Arfa even, these players all move on within a season. I think that's the problem in terms of building anything kind of sustained. But certainly if they continue to run the club as well as they have done, I can see them certainly being European challengers every year. The one potential problem for the sort of relatively near future is that have another good season, and a lot of big clubs I would assume are going to come calling for Vieira, and it might be a struggle to keep him beyond this season.
Yeah, assuming, not assuming, but potentially an Arsenal candidate in the near future. I know that Unai Emery, he's probably going to be there for some time. Arsenal will probably stand by him even if it was to go downhill from here. But you imagine that he'd be the top if he does okay between now and whenever that job becomes available. He'd be top of that list to go to Arsenal, near the top at least. Being a club legend, of course. A couple of incoming transfers to get Italian football news to Serie A. Remy Udin from Reims to Fiorentina, and Henrik Mkhitaryan to Roma, which Rich mentioned earlier. Two very different players at very different stages of their career. What do you think Roma and Fiorentina are getting?
Udin, I think, is a fantastic player. I think Reims this year, they had a great weekend at the weekend, beating Lille, and again, despite a bit of a turnover of players, they're still a very well run club with a very underrated manager in Guillon. And certainly last year, Udin was arguably their standout player, certainly their standout attacking player. And it's not surprising that clubs have come calling for him. I think there was interest with a few Premier League clubs as well. If he were to move to Fiorentina, I'm slightly surprised that he isn't going to stay at Reims for one more year, possibly with the hope of another good season and an even bigger move next year. But he's a quality player. As for Mkhitaryan, it just seems that Roma are stockpiling number 10s, and possibly they need to be looking a little bit further forward for more consistency in the goal-scoring department, apart from Dzeko.
Absolutely. Really interesting end to the transfer window across Europe, Matt.
A very interesting end to the transfer window, and a very interesting end with this jazzy music that is playing us out right now. This has been the Get European Football Show on Love Sport Radio. We'll see you next week.